What is up, guys and gals? Have you ever wanted to learn how to service your GX2 reel yourself so you didn't have to pay someone else to do it? Well, in today's video, I'll show you just that. Now, the first thing we should do is look for a schematic for this, just so we see an exploded view of the parts that go inside the reel, plus some part numbers if we need to order anything. I'm going to start by removing this handle, and this handle, as we can see, if we turn it on this side, that little knob right there is turning. It's a pass-through handle, so we have to remove this cap to get it off. It's always a good idea to remove this cap first anyhow, because sometimes under there you may have a screw and not a screw built into this little cap or knob right there. We're just going to pull that out. I'm going to pull this spool off by undoing this drag knob. And I'm pulling it straight up. And since we're going to go through our entire break through this reel, I'm going to start with the spool first and then get to this in a second. So to access these drags, we're going to stick a little flathead screwdriver inside one of those little gaps right there. Stick in and up. Keep your finger over it and it just pops out. Now we can pull those drag washers out. And what we have under here is the clicker. And to get that out, we're going to take a little screwdriver to undo that screw right there. Just gonna back that up, drop everything out of place, and I'll show you how to put that back in. Now, if I wanted to clean these, which these don't need to be cleaned, we would just use a paper towel, something like this. Let's say it was oily or wet, just a lot of liquid inside of it, and we just kind of squeeze those out. And if we need to replace it, we could check the schematics for it to find that part number. To clean this stuff, in general, I would use a Q-tip, just kind of wipe around it. Usually these things don't get too dirty. Inside here might, and down here might as well. But we just use a Q-tip or some paper towels like I did before. If we had to break any kind of grease down, I would use Corrosion X, just kind of spray inside there and wipe that out really good. Now let's say we cleaned all this stuff up. If you look right here, you'll see a little groove that rides on the top side of that spool. We're going to use that groove to put this in. I'm preempting that because I may forget to tell you. So for these drag washers, they're felt. So what I like to use is oil to oil these things. You could probably use something else like some sort of drag grease, but I like to use oil for these. Today what I'm using is a Relax oil or Speedex oil, but you can use any kind of fishing reel oil that you have around. And we want to inundate this with some oil, kind of make sure that they're fully saturated, but we don't need to add oil to every single spot because when you compress those drag washers, it will expand throughout the drag washers themselves. So first goes in is one drag washer, then one of these round washers with the slot in the middle, second drag washer, then you have an aired washer that looks like this. There's two little channels in the spool right there that this is going to drop inside of, like so. Then the final drag washer and the final keyed washer or metal washer with that little hole in the middle. Now we're going to take this little clip, stick one end into one of those grooves or into the groove that we saw there. Then we're going to take our finger and work it around to get the rest of it in. When you stick everything inside there, sometimes it doesn't set in the channel that it should be. So we kind of like to go around and use our screwdriver to pull things up, push things down, make sure it fits inside that slot. Now we're going to take the spool and turn this over. I'm going to add a little bit of oil to that hole right there. That's where the screw for that clicker is going to go. And the basic setup you're going to see for this clicker is that spring with those two prongs facing down, laying inside of it like this. And I'm going to zoom in on that, hopefully you can see it. And then this screw going through the middle of everything. So the first thing I'm going to do is take this, use my tweezers, just kind of set it up like that. Drop everything over, kind of balance that. The spring or the two ends don't need to be all the way down at this point, but it should be close. And now I'm going to take my screwdriver, add some grease to the end of it, stick it in like that, and we're going to use a screwdriver to go through both holes to try to find that screw underneath. gonna get it started. And then just kind of work it down. You might need to play with that screwdriver. Play with the spring itself to get the top part or top side of that screwdriver. You may need to play with that spring a little bit to get the top side of that screw down through it. Just got it there, and that should be set. Now we can always check it to make sure it's working. And we see that it's not. And the reason that is because the screw head didn't get down through the click tongue itself. It did get down through the spring, but not through the click tongue. So I'm just gonna, let me show you here. I'm gonna move that forward slightly and then continue on down. Now we can see that we have that working. That way and that way. The last thing we'll do here is we'll add some grease to right there where that line keeper is, just on the bronze part. The rest of it is just plastic, but that helps protect it against the salt water as well. For the drag knob, we can add some oil inside right there. You could also add grease if you wanted to. And for the handle, there's not a lot to do. Just clean it up, like I said, for cleaning the spool. But for here, when we are about to add anything to it, we can add some grease and some oil. I'm gonna add oil just to keep it a little neater. But for this end right here, I will add some grease. That's just kind of where it goes inside the shaft. So we want to protect that at all costs. We don't want that getting frozen in there. Then you can add a little bit over here to the tip of it. For the handle knob, we can add some oil right there. And you could work on adding some at the top as well. And then just kind of working that in. Now, since we've added some grease to that pivot on the handle there, we can also add some here on the threads of this screw, which is where it'll be going inside of it. Now, to access the housing, we're going to remove this click gear right here by pulling up. You'll see there's a plastic washer on top of it, that click gear, and then a metal washer underneath it. We have a screw right here that we're going to remove. Back that up counterclockwise to remove it. Then a nut that I'll use my adjustable wrench for. I think that's reversed, but it might be right to loosen. It is right. Righty to loosen this one. Let that come off, and then we're just gonna rock and pull up as we go. Now we're gonna go ahead and work on the rotor. We'll do the bail arm and the bail spring. We'll leave this in place, but if you wanted to remove that, you could just remove that screw to get that counterweight off or counterbalance weight off there. So I'm gonna start by removing that screw right there. Notice I'm holding on to the bail arm right there on both sides of it to keep it down so it doesn't shoot up on me. And I'm gonna lift up gently. I'm lifting up gently because there's a spring actuated lever on there that we see right there. Now we can pull this out. This might come out as well. And then everything else we'll leave in there for now. We'll take this side off. Both screws should be the same size, but we're gonna double check that when we take them out. And we see that they are. Now we can get this cover off by removing that screw, pulling that up. And now we have this bail or trip arm right there, and that's just a plate that we use to secure that cover on. What we have left will be this line roller, and we're going to take this screwdriver, back this up as well. Show you what's under there. You have a metal washer that's right there, or a metal plate. Then you have this plastic washer that came off that sits between those two, or between the line roller and that. Then you have a bushing inside here. And that goes in from the front side, not from the back side. Because on the back side, we're gonna have this plastic bushing. Now, if you were to change the order of this up, does it really matter? I don't really think so. But just note that you can. Just checking to see if this comes off, which it doesn't. And I think that's all we have for this. Now, in terms of cleaning these things up, we are still going to use the same principle that we used for the spool, because we see that this is not very dirty. Use my use my paper towel, and Q-tips are needed to kind of wipe out these areas. But at this point, I do also use a toothbrush to kind of brush things out. All right, I'll see you after this stuff is cleaned up. Now, a lot of the reels that I work with are used in the saltwater environment, so I use grease in a lot of places. But there's some places where you can use oil instead of grease, and this bail area is a lot of the places that you can use oil versus grease. I'll kind of go through places where I think you can put oil versus grease as we go along in this process. All right, so the first thing we're going to start with would be the trip arm. We're going to run some grease along here. I would use grease, not oil. Some grease around there. You could use oil right here if you wanted to. And maybe a little bit of grease inside that hole right there. Now on this side, we can do the same sort of thing. Just around the post, some on top. And we'll also grease this trip arm like so. Now, one of my idiosyncrasies is that I don't typically grease the bail spring, but I will grease this lever that goes inside of it. So we're going to take this the trip arm, excuse me, that long end will be going facing down, looking like that. When we get it in, we're going to take that and stick it so it goes all the way up. Then we take our spring. They both look to be at about the same size, but I'm going to look for the one that has a smaller end. And that smaller end, yeah, we have a smaller end. A smaller end will receive that lever or that arm right there. So I'm going to lay that in, looking like that, and then putting this in afterward. Now we're going to take this, make sure that it sits below the trip arm, just like that. Then we're going to cover it up and screw it down. And I'm going to snug this down all the way, but there's a possibility I may need to back this up slightly to get some play with the bail spring. Now I'll add some grease here, but you can add some oil. Some grease here, I would use grease. And I'm going to add some inside that little slot right there. Like so. Now we can go ahead and grab this line roller, or the bail wire, excuse me. Add some grease around that back side right there. You could add oil. Stick on our bushing. We don't need to grease it. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. This is balanced on both sides, so I'm just going to go ahead and grease inside those holes right there. You could add oil right here if you wanted to, or if you preferred. Take that, stick it on just like so. Now I'll take this little bushing here that's metal and grease that. You are welcome to add oil if you wanted to. And then just kind of drop that over and in. Now we have this plastic washer that we don't do anything with. That'll sit there. If it falls off, we can put it back on top of there, but it's fine. I'll grease this. Again, oil is fine. If you're using it in fresh water is what I'm referring to. I wouldn't use oil if I'm doing it for salt water, unless you're washing your reel down quite often. We're going to kind of balance everything on there. We want to make sure that that hole is visible for when we put this screw inside there. So I'm just going to put this over it, kind of balance it with my fingers, and stick this in. Now when you get to the bottom, you see that just moved up. I know I'm at the bottom there. I'm going to back this off just a little bit so I can still have some play in that bail arm. And the reason is because if I need to do any adjustments when I put this together, I'll have that room to play with it. Now if you see that little hole right there, that point on that lever will be going inside there. So it'll be going in looking like that. Then I'm going to take it, turn it, I'm going to push down at an angle until it falls in place. Basically what happened is it slipped over that post and then dropped in place like it should. And I'm gonna support it and just kind of feel to make sure everything is set. And if you feel that tension when you're pulling it back and then it's springing forward, then you know it's set. Now we can secure with the screw. I'm gonna take my 2 fingers, support that bail arm again, and then just screw it down. I'm gonna go all the way down on this one. Now I didn't grease this side, so what I'll show you is I will grease that post right there inside that hole, and that's about it. I'm gonna roll that over, put it over the post, and then add the other screw as well. Now that we finished everything there, we're gonna go ahead and snug this down, make sure it's secure, and do one final test. That looks good. We can add some grease right here, some over that counterbalance weight right there, some on the bottom, inside that little channel right there. And that's it for the rotor. All right, now let's jump into the body of the reel. And if you didn't want to do the rotor or the bail assembly, to access this, you would need to remove the rotor to get to that screw that's up there. So I'm going to remove a few screws here. First, I'm going to take this one off from the rub guard. That's going to expose one screw under there. And these screws may be different lengths or different sizes, so I'm going to set them out or lay them out when I remove them. So we have that for the bottom there. It's top left, and this one is on the side right here. But they all look to be the same size, so we're good with those things. And if you look at the schematic, it'll probably tell you the same thing, so you don't have to worry too much about that part. I'm just gonna pull this off. Now note, I did rotate this shaft all the way to the bottom, so I could have exposed that screw under there from the block. So I'll undo this screw, then pull that shaft out. Now we can pull this, that block out of there, and then pull this main gear out. See, there's a bushing on there, but there's also some washers that go between the bushing and the gear. Now, since I'm already here, I'm going to remove that crosswind gear or transfer gear. And I never take, I don't say never, I rarely take this out, and this case will be no different. I'm going to leave it in there. But I am going to remove the bushing from the other side. I notice these are plastic bushings, not bearings, but you could sub them out if you wanted to, if you just knew what the sizes were. For this reel, I don't think you need that. Now let's go ahead and get this pinion stack taken off. We're going to remove those 4 screws that we see. They will all be the same size. But I will keep them separate from those screws just to make sure we don't mess them up or mix those up. Now we just pull this cap straight up, like so. Notice that there's 2 little slots on here, but there's also some prongs in the bottom that fit in one hole on one side and the other side. So it just kind of sits down like that. Inside there we have the 1 and, well, 2, I think. We may have 2 bearings in here. Inside here we have 1 bearing. I call this the cup, but this is also doubling as the cover. And now we can pull this stack straight up. Here we have the anti-reverse, this bearing, and I think there was a washer underneath there. There it is. This is the inner race, and that's the bearing. It stays inside that entire piece right there like that. And that's it. For breaking these things down, it's the same scenario as the other ones. I may end up using some Corrosion X on this just to help break down the grease. But in general, since this looks pretty fresh, if I were to clean this off, I'm just wiping it down with a paper towel or some Q-tips. All right, so I'll see you after I clean this stuff up. Okay, for the reel, I'm gonna show you the parts of the body that I would grease. I would definitely grease up here where the bottom side of the pinion stack is gonna sit. And that little hole right there, don't really need to per se, but around there where that crosswind gear is gonna sit, inside there where that first or bottom side bushing sits, I think that's about it. What I'm noticing here, what I'll show you is if you ever wanted to remove that little cover, you'll see there's two little tabs right here. You just push those in and then kind of lift it up as you go, or you can push from this underside as you push that in. I probably wouldn't do that at all. And I'm certainly not taking it out now because there's always a risk of breaking it. Anyhow, for this side, I will do the same thing. And you'll notice that I'm not greasing the entire surface area inside here, and that's because this is a plastic body or housing, so it doesn't really need it. But there are still some places you want to grease. One in here where that top bearing sits on that cover. And I did there already. And I think that's it for the body. For the gears, I'm gonna do a light amount of grease on all these pieces, and I'm gonna have you follow along as I do it, versus me either speeding this up or cutting the video. Notice I do the threads at the top right there. And just, again, the entire surface area of that metal, the metal pieces is what we'll do. For this bottom side right here, I added a little more grease or a little extra grease than I would for the rest of the surface area of this. And then just a light coat around here. When we get to that post right there, I will add a little extra, or a little dab extra of grease as well. And if it comes off, then we can either reapply it or just use the one that we have inside the crosswind block. Light amount of grease on these gears. And the reason you do that is you do want to have a light coat on it, but understand that as these gears interact, that the teeth on the gear are going to kind of push away the grease or any excess grease that's in there. So you don't necessarily need to over grease these things. You'll have that interacting with this piece right here, and then those teeth meshing will push that extra grease out. And this is a pretty quick job. Doesn't need to be perfect. You kind of just want to get them coated and you should be fine. Understand also that if you do put too much grease on there, you can make the reel feel very sluggish, or more sluggish than it needs to be when you're using it. I did add some grease inside those holes right there on this side and on this side. That's where the shaft of the handle goes through. And we don't want to have that getting frozen up in there. So I'm gonna take this, just kind of clean this off a little bit, but I will inspect that anti-reverse clutch to make sure everything looks good, which it does. And what I'm looking for here is any typical faint orangey tinge or kind of sign, any sign of rust or debris, and I don't see any there. If I did see any of those things, what I would do is take a Q-tip and just kind of run it around, see what comes off on the Q-tip, just to get an idea of how severe it is. This one doesn't have it, so we'll leave that alone. For that, I think that's all we're gonna do. If we missed anything along the way, or as we go reinstalling everything, we'll do it then. For the bearings, I will go ahead and add some oil to them. And every place you saw me grease here and oil here is what I would use. I would not use oil in lieu of the grease that I used. There is an argument to use something called, or something similar, or like inox, where you can use them on gears and they kind of stick in one place. But I'm more of a grease guy, so I don't want to encourage you to use oil on gears. So I'm gonna start with the first washer, which is this one. I'm sorry, the first bushing. I'm gonna stick that in, and the reason I do that is because sometimes I forget to put that back in. I have to take everything apart to put it back in. One place I did miss was here, and I'm gonna grease under that cover right there. That's where that end of the block will be riding to go up and down. And as well, right there. There's a little ridge inside there. Okay, so we're gonna start with the pinion stack first. I'm gonna put on one of the bearings. Then we'll stick this plate on, but I'm gonna stick this in first because it'll be a little easier this way, I think. Drop that in, looking like that, and then we can drop this on over it, and it fits inside of a little recessed area right there. Stick this on, it's the same on both sides, so it doesn't matter how you put it on, you won't mess it up. And then we just drop this in place. And we're gonna have this sitting somewhere in that general area. Now I'm gonna take this bearing, stick that on there. You can put it there, or you could take it and drop this inside here, like so. Either one works. Notice that I lined this up in this direction. The reason I did that is because, remember when we took it off, we had two little holes on either side here where those two posts will go into, but we also have two slots, one there and one there, that are perpendicular to those two posts. So they need to sit over it looking something like this. When we get it down, we're just slightly rotate it until it falls in place, which we just saw that it did. Now we can secure those with the screws. When you're putting these screws in, you want to make sure they're going in pretty smoothly. You don't want them feeling like they're binding up right away. If they are, just back them out and start over. If you continue with them when you feel it binding up, you are essentially rethreading the inside and opening the hole up, which means it becomes non-effective in the future. So it doesn't really support or hold down the base or whatever it's trying to hold down. In this case, the cover. And that's good. I'm gonna rotate it just to feel it. We knew it was gonna work. Now we can take our crosswind gear, drop that in. We're gonna have that post somewhere in that area. We're gonna take our block. This end of the block right here will be going under that plate, and this end will be riding on top of that little ridge right there that I talked about earlier. I'm gonna drop that in. We wanna make sure that slot right there goes over that post. So we're gonna look for it, kind of feel for it, stick it in. You're gonna go in at an angle like that. Now we're gonna go ahead and get this main gear in. Just drop that in. We're gonna rotate it until it falls in place, but we're rotating gently because we don't wanna move that block out of position because we'll need to put the shaft in through it. That dropped in place, and you can see it's meshing with the pinion gear. Now we can take our shaft, and we'll see that there's one deeper cut as opposed to the other side. The deeper cut will be facing up towards the sky when looking at it this way. I'm gonna add a little bit of grease to right here where it's gonna interact with the block. I don't put any typically on this shaft itself, but if you wanted to, you certainly could. Now I'm gonna stick that in with the deeper cut facing up. I wanna support the block as I push because they don't always line up. We need to pull it over slightly to kind of get them to line up, and then push down to expose that hole. Now we can take our screw and secure that. And that's good. Now before we forget, we can go ahead and take this shim washer, put that back on the main gear. Now I'll take my bushing, drop that on over in this direction, and then we can cover this up. We'll do one double check to make sure nothing's missing, which it isn't. And then we're gonna drop this over, kind of set that in place. And we can see that that's set. And I'm gonna secure all these 4 screws that we got out of here. Now when you're putting these screws in, you don't want to tighten them or snug them down all the way yet, but you kind of want to get them started or close to the bottom. Then when you get them all in close to the bottom like that, you can tighten them down. All right, now when we get to this part right here, we're gonna add a little bit of grease to right here. Now, like I said earlier, this is plastic, so you don't really need to do this. But part of the benefit of doing it here is if water gets inside here and settles, it doesn't affect any metal pieces that are in here. And we're looking more for any greening in this scenario because again, it is more of a plastic cover that we're dealing with. Now, if you notice right there, there was a tab at the top right there. I'm gonna take that tab, kind of line it up first, stick it in, and then drop the bottom in place. And then we'll just secure that. So now that we've got all those 4 screws in, we can now go ahead and put this rotor on there. I'm gonna take it and just kind of rotate it until it falls in place, just like it did right there. The reason that is because this rotor is keyed above or keyed just like that pinion gear is. Now I'll take some residual grease, add it to this metal piece, drop it over, then kind of rotate that until it falls in place over that pinion gear as well. We're going to take this nut, that flat side will be facing down, and then rotating it to secure it to the, or rotating it on the pinion to secure it to the rotor. Remember, this one is going to be lefty tighty, so go backwards to tighten this one. Our end result is we want one of those flat sides lined up with the hole for that lock screw, and I'll show you that in a second. That's right about there. Have that flat side facing that hole, and then we'll secure it with this lock screw. Don't go too hard, just get it down to the bottom. Now we can get this on, that metal washer there, the click gear or ratchet, and this plastic piece on top.